So that is the very brilliant Mr. Johnny Cash, just a few months before he passed away, singing a song that was written 10 years before by a guy called Trent Reznor and a band called Nine Inch Nails. Trent Reznor was 22 when he wrote that song. Johnny Cash was 80 years old when he sang it. Think about the words that he's singing. That isn't a 22-year-old song. That's an 80-year-old song. That's a song of a man who's seen some things, who's experienced some things. He's got this moment towards the end of his life where he's just like, what was it all? Like, there's people I've lost, there's people I've loved. He has these evocative lyrics, and then there's the shaking hand as he pours out this glass of wine, and there's just these moments, that final shutting of the piano, and just then silence. This is Johnny Cash at his absolute best. When he said he wanted to do this song, Trent Reznor said to him, "I'm not so sure. Sounds kind of corny." And then they saw the video that they put together. And Trent Reznor and Nine Inch Nails said, "You know what? That song isn't ours anymore. It belongs to Johnny Cash." There was something about what he did that was just this profoundness to it. It's a man who's experienced change and suffering. We're going to spend a few weeks talking about change. Now, I promised that the whole thing, we're going to do 5 weeks on this. We're going to look at different directions that I think God would have us follow in change. The whole thing isn't going to be morose. But we're going to start with the idea of backwards, which is going to have some elements of just like, we're going to feel some stuff today. We're going to explore some of those deep emotions. But before we get into it, let me just say this. I've been sick the last part of this week. So I slept about 2 hours last night. What I put together was brilliant. What comes out may not be good at all. So if my constant sniffing irritates you, I shouldn't have mentioned it, you never would have noticed if I hadn't said anything, then I'm sorry, you'll have to pick another church. It's what you got today. If what comes out seems a jumble of thoughts, it's what you got today. This is sickness, Alex, but we're going to have some fun together. How many of you guys have experienced change at some point? Of course you have. Everyone has had change. So the easy change, I think, to manage is the change that you are in control of. Think about like the change, okay, you grow up, you don't have much control over that, but after a while, when you're no longer kids, you guys here, you have very little life choices. Your parents get to tell you what to do, and that's wonderful. I say that as a parent, it's great. But there's these moments where you start to make life decisions. You maybe choose to get married. I have a picture of here of Laura and I. We just had our 10th wedding anniversary not long ago. And there we look essentially the same as we do now, which is good for 10 years later. And then you make other choices. You maybe choose to have a child. And we had our first child, Elena, in 2012. And it was just this moment of like, oh my goodness, things are never going to be the same again. I remember the moment that freaked me out was the moment, not that she was born, not the moment she appeared. That was too surreal to freak me out. She swam out into the water like this little fish, and it was incredible. It was a water birth, and it just blew my mind. And then we had the hospital visits, people came to see us, and that seemed normal as well. And then we dropped in at my parents' house on the way back from the hospital just to see some people. They had about 40 people over for a family party for my brother, and we just dropped and passed this baby around, and that all seemed normal. And then there was this moment when we got back to the house and put the baby down in the car seat and realized this thing was going to be there all the time. It was going to be there all the time. She was going to be there all the time. So we had Elena. And then a couple of years later, we had Gigi. And again, that was different. But again, a change that we were choosing. We were making these active life choices. And then we had our third child, Jude. And if you've got 3 children, 3 children is a game changer. It's different than 2. Very different. There's a reason that his name is Jude. It's like as close as you can get to the book of Revelation without actually being there. It's like, this is the end. No more. That's a negotiation. My wife would not say that was a hard and fast no. But you have these moments, and I haven't tried 4, and hopefully we'll see. But these are changes that we actively get to participate in. They're hard, they're different. Getting married is different. Suddenly you are no longer lord of your own empire, no longer doing everything that you want. The hardest change to process, I think, is the change that we have no control over whatsoever. We have these moments where something happens in our life, and it brings change, and change brings loss, and loss brings grief. And that's hard to handle. It's hard to handle whether it's an organizational change like the one we're walking through. It's hard to handle when it's personal change. And we'll look at both for a little while. I had a wise friend who said to me this when I came on board here at OneChurch. I came here as a teaching pastor, as an associate pastor. And he said to me this, he said, enjoy being an associate pastor. And I said, I will. I'm super excited. I don't have to have any other responsibility. I get to be disruptive, which I like. I get to teach, which I love. And so I was celebrating this moment. And he said, so many of the assistant pastors that have worked for me have wanted to jump that phase. They've wanted to be in charge and they've missed this great opportunity. I said, that's not me. Like, I'm in it for, I could do 2 years being an assistant pastor, 3 years. I love it. And then we got here and then things began to change. Our last pastor, Pastor Chris, said I think it was about 80 days after we got here that they were moving on. And for me, there was a sense of, I don't want that. I want things to stay as they are. There's this moment of something suddenly that you can't control. And that change brings a sense of loss. And loss brings grief. And grief has to be processed. Now, before we get too far in, let me say this. There are some of you that may be deeply grieving over something very personal. So I'm going to try and walk us through this on a fairly lighthearted, fairly surface level way. But there's people that we know that if you need to do that deep walking through of something with someone, then we would love to help you find that. I don't want to sort of treat what you're going through as glib or anything like that, but there's moments during this time that I'll try and keep it somewhat lighthearted. And what we're going to do to talk about change is we're going to try and root some of our story, what's going on as a community, what's going on in our individual lives, in this story from years and years ago. We're going to take this character called Joshua in the Bible and watch what happens when this great leader Moses passes away. Now, I'm not saying that Chris is Moses or I'm Joshua. Those guys both had way better beards than either of us. They were like really substantial beards. So there's not all the parallels, but there are some connections between what happens when a leader leaves an organization and when someone else is there in their place. And we're going to try and lock into that. Think about this group of people. If you don't know the Old Testament story, Moses was a legend. A group of people, we've talked about this passage before, he takes them out of slavery. He takes them out of this land where they're prisoners. They have no choices. They have no freedoms. Everything is decided for them. To try and come up with a parallel, we would have to talk about slavery in Britain or America in the late 18th century and beyond. We talk about people, this is Adula Equiano. He was a slave taken from Africa to America, and he talked about just what it meant to have all of those choices ripped away from you, to have that sense of loss. He would have been considered a prince in his own country and suddenly found himself serving somebody else for no pay. This is the kind of thing we're talking about. This is the experience we're talking about when we talk about the Israelite people. They have lost all of their freedoms. They've lost their land, and now they're in a country that isn't their own. Egypt in the Old Testament, it's this empire. It's the evil thing. It's the place where there are no choices. Nothing good comes out of Egypt. And Moses, through God, takes them out. He does what nobody else could do. He stands up to Pharaoh. Pharaoh is the most important person in all of the land. And Moses, this guy, has stared Pharaoh in the face. And Pharaoh's eyes dropped first. That never happened. Pharaoh could stand up to anyone. He had an army to back him up. And in this moment, Moses stands up to Pharaoh, and Pharaoh flinches first. And Moses leads this group of people we talked about a couple of weeks ago. It's called an Arab Rav. It's not just this one Jewish group of people. It's a mass multitude, a mix of different people from all different backgrounds that have no common identity, have no common laws. And Moses, God through Moses, takes this community and makes them one. The theologian Walter Brueggemann says this. What he does is he gives them orientation. He gives them orientation. He gives them this sense of, we know who we are. What I would say is it's kind of like this. I'm going to do a little building here for you. It's like he takes these bricks and he gives them this sense of structure. Bit by bit, this community that doesn't understand each other, doesn't know each other, suddenly starts to have rules that they all agree should be obeyed. They suddenly start to have a God that they worship together. They're suddenly dreaming about having their own land. All of these things, it's slowly building. building, building. This is what Moses does for this group of people. And then suddenly, Moses, who's always been there, isn't there anymore. Moses is suddenly gone. We've got this passage from the Bible, I think, that we can read that talks about exactly how that happens. Then Moses climbed Mount Nebo from the plains of Moab to the top of Pisgah, across from Jericho. There the Lord showed him the whole land from Gilead to Dan, all of Naphtali, the territory of Ephraim and Manasseh, all the land of Judah, as far as the Mediterranean Sea, the Negev, the whole region from the valley of Jericho, the city of palms, as far as Zoar. Then the Lord said to him, this is the land I promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, when I said, I will give it to your descendants. I have let you see it with your eyes, but you will not cross over unto it. And Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in Moab, as the Lord had said. He buried him in Moab in the valley opposite Beth Peor, but to this day no one knows where his grave is. Moses was 120 years old when he died, yet his eyes were not weak nor his strength gone. The Israelites grieved for Moses in the plains of Moab 30 days, until the time of weeping and mourning was over. Let's pray as we get further into this text. God, thank you in the time of change you are with us. Just as you were with this group of people, this Arab Raf, this mixed multitude, you guided them through Moses. And then there came this time when Moses wasn't. As we think about our community, about who you've made us to be, God, help us to root backwards, to figure out what that means, to take time to appreciate it, to take time to realize that in change we can experience loss. In loss, it can bring grief. And grief can be disorientating. Help us to understand this. Amen. So what I would suggest is that Moses dying in this community is this process where they suddenly lose all sense of who they are. Disorientation is something that you can. So I used to grow up surfing on the southwest of England. I would learn to surf on these nice crystal clear waves. They broke nice and slowly. And then I went out to a place in France called Hossegor. And suddenly the waves look completely different. Suddenly they're huge mammoth waves, sometimes 12, 15 foot high. And as you stand on top of them, you look down into this deep, dark pit of the ocean. And you realize that you're standing on one of those powerful forces in the world. And of course, I'm not very good at surfing. So there were times when that would end calamitously. And in that moment, what would happen is this: the wave would catch you and it would turn you upside down. And then, if you didn't get back to the surface in time, the next wave would come across, and that would catch you. And again, you'd tumble, and you'd have this sense of, where is the board? Where is everybody else? Where are the rocks? Where's the ocean floor? And you'd tumble, and you could get caught in 2 or 3 waves at a time. That's what I mean by the process of becoming disorientated. That's what I mean by that sense of suddenly everything goes into panic mode. There's that sense of, what is going on here? That's what I think that these people, these Israelites, experience in this moment when Moses, their leader, is no longer there. There's been moments in the story beforehand where we've seen this sense that they're overly reliant on Moses. Moses goes to the top of the mountain, it says, to speak to God. And in that moment, when he doesn't come back in a day, they go to his brother Aaron and say, build us a god, because Moses, this guy that rescued us, we don't know where he is anymore. Moses has become he's become a crutch for them. They're over-reliant on him. And when he dies, it all becomes very disorientating. When you experience change, I think something similar happens. Something similar happens in our life. We go into that sense of what is happening here? Now, when you're on the outside of the story, as we are, we're reading this story as outsiders, our natural thought might be, well, what's next for these people? What's going to happen? But when you experience change in your life, is that what you think? Is that your immediate reaction? What's next? I don't think it is. I think your natural reaction is this sense of I'm panicked, I'm disorientated, I'm hurting. We see this in organizations. They say that the most dangerous time in a company's life is the time that the founder of that company died. A university out in Denmark they did research on 750 companies and looked what happens to these companies when they lose a CEO or lose a president. Over 60% of them saw their sales drop to a huge degree. The most challenging time in the life is the loss of the founder. And a large number of organizations didn't even survive this person losing. It's like something happens where the blocks suddenly get removed, and suddenly the whole structure can come down. But that's not just true of organizations. It's also true for us individually. When we experience moments of change, especially change that we didn't choose, we have that sense of disorientation. This can be a number of different things. I just threw up some examples here. It could be in the moment where we experience a death. We have that sense of the person that we've lost is no longer with us physically, but they are still with us in this spiritual sort of like emotional sense. It feels like we're not ready to let go. There's that moment of pain. There's that moment of suffering. It can happen in divorce and separation. It can happen in sickness. The writer Todd Billings said the hardest thing to compute as a young person being diagnosed with cancer was that suddenly all his expectations of what life would look like were no longer true. Having a diagnosis like that is painful for anybody, but to a certain degree, if you've lived out part of your the most of your life script, if you've got to grow up and you've got to get married and you've got to have kids and you've got to have grandkids, you start to get to the point where the expectations have been met. But for him as a professor at 30 years old, he said suddenly everything that I'd assumed would be true about my life was no longer true. Loss, change brings loss. And loss brings grief. And grief is disorientating. And it requires us to take time to process it. And that's what I hope we can do in this time together. So often the time that we get to see grief, we get to see it in pop culture. It's one of the only ways I think we feel safe exploring those things. So I've got a couple of examples here of people processing grief in particularly evocative ways. This is America's grandfather, Mr. Tom Hanks, in Sleepless in Seattle, channeling my 80s child again. He said this: well, I'm going to get out of bed every morning, breathe in and out all day long. Then after a while, I won't have to remind myself to get out of bed every morning and breathe in and out. And then after a while, I won't have to think about how I had it great and perfect for a while. Isn't that just that sense of like, It's the same as that Johnny Cash song. He really hits those notes of emotion, those emotional chords, that sense of like, it's not what I expected. This is W.H. Auden, who's a war poet from Britain. He was my north, my south, my east and west, my working week and my Sunday rest, my noon, my midnight, my talk, my song. I thought that love would last forever. I was wrong. The stars are not wanted now. Put out everyone. Pack up the moon and dismantle the sun. Pour away the ocean and sweep up the wood. For nothing now can ever come to any good. This guy just brings out that sense of, it's painful. Søren Kierkegaard, the writer, said this about poets. Next slide. What is a poet? He's an unhappy man who hides deep anguish in his heart, but whose lips are so formed that when the sigh and cry pass through them, it sounds like lovely music, and people flock around the poet and say, sing again soon. That is, may new sufferings torment your soul, but your lips be fashioned as before, for the cry would only frighten us, but the music that is blissful. That's what's happening every time you hear a song on the radio that talks about loss and pain, and you think that's a beautiful song. Every time you read a poem and think that's a beautiful piece of writing. The poet's lips are just so formed that when they scream, it sounds beautiful to us in a way that if you or I exclaimed it, it wouldn't sound beautiful. This is this process that the Bible calls lament. The Bible is actually a huge fan of it all the way through. It takes this idea of lament and grief really seriously. And this is problematic to me because I'm English and we don't lament well at all. During the Second World War, in about 1939, it became widely assumed that the Nazis were going to invade Britain. They would actually have a base in Britain and they would begin to take over the whole country. So the British government started to put posters around that told people what to do if this happened. And this was their advice. Keep calm and carry on. Just go about everyday life. Just keep going. It's a British cultural thing called the stiff upper lip. And we do it very well. It's the idea that was around, especially till about 20 years ago, that especially as a male, you shouldn't show emotion. The idea of a quivering lip was the one of someone who's about to cry. And so they would say, keep a stiff upper lip. Don't show any emotion at all. We have poems by British writers that go into detail on this thing. Rudyard Kipling wrote a poem called If you can take victory and defeat and treat them both the same, you will be a man, my son. But they're not the same, are they? They're completely different. Why would you treat victory and defeat the same? It's nonsense. And yet this is what you get taught as a British guy growing up. You don't cry. You keep a stiff upper lip. You don't lament at all. But fortunately for us, the Jewish culture was very different to that. When they experienced loss, they took grief seriously. And that first involved looking backwards at what had been. In actual fact, the Jewish people, in this exact passage we just looked at, talks about them grieving for Moses along the lines recommended, 30 days. And they had these 3 things that they would do, 3 Hebrew words that describe the different parts of their grief. They had the aninut, which was this almost rending of the garments. They would literally rip their clothes. It was this moment of agony of like, this is so painful, I don't know what to do with it. And then you'd move on after a couple of days of that to the shiva, where you would have family come in and they would sit with you and they would process with you, and you didn't have to leave the house, you didn't have to cook, people took care of you, and they would be with you. And then finally, there's the last part, which I can't pronounce correctly, the shelashim, which is this moment where suddenly they're encouraging you to start re-entering normal life again. The idea that we have of the different stages of grief that you may be familiar with, the 5 stages of grief, this actually reflected this really accurately. Now, I don't think the 5 stages of grief are necessarily this road. I think they're things that happen to you in different spots. Sometimes you can be in one part, sometimes you can be another. But the Jewish people took seriously this sense of, let us make sure that we take time to remember what was. Take time to acknowledge the fact that we have lost and that losing somebody hurts an awful lot. Losing somebody hurts an awful lot. This was the process that they put in place for Moses. They took time to remember that Moses had done all of these incredible things. He had given them their sense of orientation. They took time to appreciate that. Next slide, please, guys. I think what we get to do when we look back is we get to acknowledge how you've been hurt. How you've been hurt by the loss. How it doesn't make sense to you. But also possibly how you've been hurt by a particular person. Sometimes we have this sense that we've been hurt maybe by church. Maybe you've been in a church and it didn't go well. Maybe you were in a marriage and it ended badly. Sometimes we think an organization can hurt you. And actually an organization never hurts you really. It's always a person when it comes down to it. Maybe 1 or 2 people. Taking the time, whether it's an individual moment of grief or a corporate sense of grief, to look back and say, that's really hurt me, is a really important thing to do. It's this idea of lament, this idea of sorrow. There's a psalm here where the Bible reflects that process. My God, why have you abandoned me? Why are you so far away when I groan for help? Every day I call to you, my God, but you do not answer. Every night I lift my voice, but I find no relief. My life is poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint. My heart is like wax melting within me. My strength has dried up like sun-baked clay. My tongue sticks to the roof of my mouth. You have laid me in the dust, and you have left me for dead. This is this process of realizing that when you're hurt, your fists are actually raised at somebody. And sometimes the person that they're raised at, you find is God. Sometimes it's this sense of God has let me down. That's not a bad thing to say. You can say that safely in church. God is incredibly able to take this grief directed at him by this writer. He's able to take that and not respond in anger, but respond in love. We see Jesus enter into the process of grief in John chapter 11. He goes to visit his sick friend Lazarus and gets there a couple of days late and finds out that Lazarus has passed away. And he asks where they have laid him, and he goes out with the family, and they weep at the grave. And it says in John chapter 11:35, the shortest verse in the Bible, Jesus wept. He saw their emotion, and he entered into it. He felt that sense of injustice that they felt. He felt that sense of agony, that sense of death being the ultimate enemy. He felt that, and he stood alongside them. And when he left, in John chapter 14 through 16, he starts to talk about what's going to happen to this group of disciples after he's gone. And he says, I won't leave you as orphans. I will send another comforter to be with you. He was talking about the Holy Spirit. I will ask the Father. He will give you another advocate to help you and be with you forever, the Spirit of truth. The world cannot accept him because it neither sees him nor knows him. But you know him, for he lives with you and will be in you. I will not leave you as orphans. I will come to you. Jesus also called himself an advocate. But when it uses the word advocate or paraclete or comforter about Jesus, it's talking more in the legal sense. It's the idea of a lawyer. Some of you have needed a lawyer at different points, and it's got this sense of like, I've got this like person that's going to defend me, is going to stand up for me. When it uses it of the Holy Spirit, it uses it more in the sense of someone who brings comfort, who stands alongside at your darkest hour, embraces you, goes through the process with you. How I describe it to people is this: Laura and I are both advocates to our kids, but I am more the defender and she is more the comforter, if that makes sense. She's more the arm embrace, put an arm around it. If someone messes with my kids, I'm going to be super angry. I'm going to want to do something about it. But she's the one that's the come alongside, the comfort one. This is the role that Jesus said that the Holy Spirit takes. And part of our response to grief is to look back and realize that God was with us the whole time. That at the time can be hard to see, but reflecting back is what enables us to see that God with us in the moments of grief. He was there the whole time. The thing about life is life has to be lived forwards, but it can only really be understood when you look backwards. That's what happens as we take grief seriously. This is what this passage invites us into as a community. But not just to grief, actually. I think it invites us to something more than grief. It invites us to thanksgiving. And that's a wonderful thing, too. We get to look back and acknowledge how you can be thankful. Think about this community, this group of people. They have suddenly this loss of this leader, and as they reflect back, they get to see God at work in them in ways that they didn't even realize he was working. Check out this passage back earlier in Deuteronomy. It's a couple of slides on, I think, guys. We can skip that one for now. This slide earlier back in Deuteronomy, we say, and now Moses used to take a tent and pitch it outside the camp some distance away, calling it the tent of meeting. Anyone inquiring of the Lord would go to the tent of meeting outside the camp. And whenever Moses went out to the tent, all the people rose and stood at the entrances to their tents, watching Moses until he entered the tent. As Moses went into the tent, the pillar of cloud would come down and stay in the entrance while the Lord spoke with Moses. Wherever the people saw the pillar of cloud standing at the entrance to the tent, they all stood and worshipped, each at the entrance of their tent. The Lord would speak to Moses face to face as one speaks to a friend. Then Moses would return to the camp, but his young-aged Joshua, son of Nun, did not leave the tent. You see this process with Moses interacting with this God in a way that nobody else in this group of people really did, except for this guy Joshua. It says that when Moses left the tent where God was, Joshua stayed. Joshua was there developing this intimate relationship with God. He was developing the ability to lead this people. God was preparing Joshua way, way, way before Moses would ever pass away. Reflecting back, this group of people got to see God at work in them all the time. God was present even when it was difficult, even when it was hard. That's true of us personally in our grief. We get to see those moments as followers of Jesus. We get to see this comforter who walks alongside even in the darkest moments. It doesn't make everything okay. It doesn't make all of the pain disappear. It doesn't end the grief. In actual fact, sometimes it's a road into exploring that grief and coming to learn from it. But we do realize he never left us in those moments. What happens here, according to this author that we talked about earlier? was the process gets finished up. We had orientation and everything was built. And then we had disorientation where everything gets broken. And then when you get to reflect like this, what happens is it's called surprising reorientation. Out of nowhere, somehow it's possible that the blocks begin to fit back together again. It may not happen quickly. It may not happen exactly as you foresaw it happening, but somehow God has this incredible way of beginning to put the blocks back together again. Looking back and reflecting and being thankful can help us to do that. This group of people looked back and saw God's hand in their community and were able to be thankful. We, as a group of people, get to look back in our community and be thankful. For some of you that are new, that may be a harder thing to do, but for some of you that have been here for a long time, that probably makes sense. We get to be thankful for Chris and his family and what they brought to this community for a time. We get to think about Paul and his family, the people that founded the church in this building originally. And we get to think about what they brought for a time. We get to think about people like Denise and John who were here for a time. We get to think about people like Linda and Skip that were here for a time. We get to look at these people, names that may not be familiar to you guys, to all of you, but names that helped keep this building here and this church here, year after year after year after year. And what we get to see is that they were never the point, just as Moses was never the point. What it really gets us to do in the end is not look backwards at people. It brings healing and allows us to get to this point where we look upwards. Because this Jewish community was only what it was because of God in the midst of them. This church community will only survive and only be what it can be if the focus is God in the midst of us. It's not about Alex and our criticism here. It's not about a group of people on a leadership team or a committee. It's not about pastoral figures that will come in and go out. It's not about Chris and Krista that were here. It's not about Paul and his wife that were here. It's not about any one person. Because this church, if it really is a church, is founded on Jesus, who said, I will build my church, his church. We get to look back as a group of people and we get to take grief seriously. And as I said, this has a tendency to be a heavy topic. But then we realize as we do that, next week we'll reflect upwards. We'll look at this God who is the center of this community. And then, excitingly, we get to start talking about vision. We start to realize that when we look up and take our eyes off a person, God gives us vision to move forward, and forwards becomes the step after that. And things then start to roll and get very exciting. But taking time to realize we have lost is actually okay. There's a couple of things that I'd love you to do to reflect during the week. It may be a personal thing. You may be still dealing with grief from way back in the past. You may be dealing with grief that's present now. And all grief is this sense of loss. And loss can come from any change, especially one you don't have control over. To embrace surprising reorientation, there's a couple of questions here. One is, what am I hurting for? How am I hurting? You might reflect that as, how have I lost something? For everyone, we've experienced those things, those changes, those losses. Maybe a thing for you to do this week is this process of saying, God, how have I lost? How am I hurting? Are my fists still raised because of that grief? Are they raised at you because I feel like you should have done something? Are they raised at a person? Is that sense of, I need to forgive, I need to let go? Is there this sense of hurt because you had a pastor here that is no longer here? The community is changing around you. Those are hurtful things as well. How are you hurting? How am I hurting? And then another question. How am I thankful? What has happened here in this building that you are thankful for over the years? How have you seen God move in your lives in different church communities? How do you see God's fingerprints over the hard parts of your life as you get to live life forwards but reflect and understand it backwards? Those, I think, are two key questions in us processing our sense of grief and loss. And as we process, we get to move upwards and forwards into the exciting happy parts. I'm going to invite the worship team to come back on stage. I'm going to close us with some prayer. we're going to carry on with our Sunday. God, thank you for your presence here with us. We've talked about this sense of grief, this sense of loss, this sense of hurt. Whenever we experience change, it can bring loss. Loss brings grief, and grief is disorientating. God, help us to choose to do the hard work with our grief. Some of us may have lost jobs that we loved. Some of us may have lost family members that we loved, relationships that meant a lot. We may be dealing with sickness, and suddenly our questions of what's next suddenly seem just really poignant and really painful. God, as we explore those things, help us to ask, how am I hurting? How am I thankful? To reflect back with you. God, thank you that you're present here to bring healing. Sometimes you work through gifted counselors that can help us articulate where our grief is. And we pray for those opportunities for people. Sometimes you work in the middle of a song, in the middle of a poem. As we read, as we think, God, I pray for people this week that they would know a sense of healing from grief. They'd know that that process may be difficult, but it's starting to work. God, thank you that you're here with us today. Thank you for the exciting times that are ahead for this community as we look upward to you next week. We get to have a new sense of you being the center of this thing. This isn't about me. This isn't about anyone sitting in any seats or standing on a stage. This isn't about a leadership team. This is about you building your church and giving us a sense of mission and vision for the community around us. God, wherever you're leading, we follow you joyfully. Help us to follow you on the journey you have for us and invite people along. Thank you, Jesus, for being present with us today. Amen.